Hi folks, welcome back. Listen, I was thinking today we could maybe have a brief conversation about the art of effective communication. Alright, listen, I am convinced that we all enter into our interactions, our communications with other people with the best of intentions, am I right? Right, sometimes there's just a point that we want to put across, or there's something that we want to say, and then the words that leave our mouth sometimes aren't always an accurate reflection of what we intended to say, and then we can end up putting our foot in our mouth and hurting someone's feelings or making a mess of, or something like this. So I reckon that as human beings, we all have this endless opportunity for improvement, especially in the area of our communications. I want to share with you an interesting idea today, and just kind of share with you my rendition of a story. It's quite an old story, taken from a book called The Republic that was written by one of my favourite philosophers called Plato. This story was written more of a conversation between a teacher and his student. And this story was called The Cave, right? The original story was called The Analogy of the Cave or something like this. So as this story goes, there was a community of people who lived and resided in this cave. Generations and generations had been born into this cave, so this cave was all that they knew. Now these people were they would sit with their backs up against this wall, bound by their ankles and by their wrists by chains. These chains that were kind of tied and shackled onto the ground. So they would sit there, and there was this other group of people inside of the cave who would come and bring them food and all that sort of thing. So anyway, they would look up at this wall at the back of the cave, and for years they would sit there and wonder, looking up at all these kind of monsters and dragons and demons and angels and gods and devils and all this kind of thing. And what they thought they were looking at was real things. They'd never seen or known anything different. Now, one day, one of the men in this community that was kind of bound by these shackles, one of the shackles had broken. I mean, he'd been sitting there for years, it had gone a bit rusty, and this was it. Over a few hours, he kind of shook his wrist free. He managed to, break free from the other kind of chains. And this was the first time of his life he actually considered whether there's anything else going on other than these shadows and silhouettes on this back wall of this cave. He didn't even know that he was in a cave. He couldn't have called these shadows because he didn't know what shadows were. No one had ever told him. So it took him a couple of hours to pluck up the courage to look behind him. And as he looked behind him, behind this wall, what he realised was that a bit further back, towards the back of this room or cave, there was like a fire, this light. Now, he'd never seen anything like this before. The only light he'd ever seen was the reflection of light that was cast upon the back wall of the cave. You've got to understand this. So this was the first time that he'd ever seen light of this form, and it hurt his eyes. It took him a few moments to kind of come to terms with this light. And as he kind of looked up, he could then see all these people, these men and women walking back and forth. They were kind of like puppeteers, and they had all of these different objects, wooden animals, all this different stuff. And what he began to realise was that what he thought he'd been looking at his entire life, he thought all these things were real things. He could now see that this light, this fire at the back of the cave, was actually projecting shadows of these people and these puppeteers with their objects onto the back wall of the cave. For the first time of his life, his eyes were opened. It was kind of like the scales fell off. He was blind and now he could see. So he could now see the connection between these people and these puppets and these objects and the fire and the silhouettes in the back of the cave. But he was bewildered by this. He didn't have the vocabulary to be able to communicate articulately what he was now seeing. He was just intrigued. He was kind of captivated by what was going on. Now, two of the guards of the cave quickly identified that this guy had broken free. So he didn't want this kind of man to go back into the ranks and bring about a bit of discord. So they ended up grabbing him frog marching him out of the cave where they threw him outside. Now, for the first time of his life, this was it. This was him outside, fresh air, there was wind. As he looked up to the sky, for the first time of his life, he saw the sun. Now, he didn't have words to define what he was seeing. He could see trees, he could see woods. Out in the distance, he could even see a city with these tall buildings. But again, he didn't have words to articulate any of these things. He just saw things, and he started coming up with words to define all these things. He saw animals in the fields. He started coming up with names to define all these animals because he'd never seen them before. Now, absolutely confounded with what he was seeing, he was walking around, and then he thought to himself for a minute, my goodness, what about my old friends, my family, my brothers, my sisters, all my old camaraderie from back in the cave? I've got to go back in there and tell them that what they think they're looking at isn't real. I've got to go back and enlighten them. I've got to go and share with them what I know. So he kind of stealth mode, done a bit of a James Bond style type thing, ended up sneaking back into the cave. He managed to work his way back into the ranks of this old community that he was once part of. And he sat there and he just nudged the guy on the left and the woman on the right, and he said, listen to me. See what you are looking at right now. You know what you've been looking at your whole life? It's not real. These shadows aren't real things. They're just silhouettes of men and women and puppeteers who are walking back and forth on a wall up behind us, which is just a reflection of this fire that's way back in the back of the cave. And I know that you don't know what fire is, but that doesn't matter. You're just going to have to take my words for it. And even all the stuff inside of the cave that we think are real things, they're not real things, because then there's this big outside world. There's reality and actuality. And outside in the cave, there's a city, and there's some woods and some trees and some cows and some sheep and some donkeys and some people and some cyclists, and you've got to drive about 1.5 meters, apart from them now, or you're going to get fined by the police. And he started going off on this rant about all the stuff that he was seeing. And do you know what response he got from the people, this community that he used to be part of? They looked at him and they said, "Oh my goodness, you're crazy. You've got to be completely nuts. Let's lock you up in the nut house. You've possibly got a mental disorder or something like that." All right, now, okay, so that's not the perfect rendition of the original story. It's certainly not accurate in any way. That's just the Kain Ramsay version. But it's an interesting idea, and I reckon there's something we can take from this. And this is essentially about how it is that we communicate and interact with other people. Because we all go through life with a degree of understanding of life, of ourselves, of how the world is. Most people don't have any comprehension, many people don't even begin to appreciate that the way in which they see things isn't always how things are. Which means that when some of us get into this journey of kind of personal growth, self-improvement, we start to understand a few philosophical or psychological things, a few principles, we start to grow in a little bit of wisdom. If we share what we have come to understand with other people in a way that isn't palatable and in a way that doesn't meet them where they're at, guess who's going to end up getting rejected and called mad? That's right, us. What I've come to appreciate over the years is that if we want to communicate with people well, if we want to influence people well, it's all about taking them on a journey. In the same way that I'm just trying to take you on one today. So listen, gonna love you, gonna leave you. I'm sure you've got a little bit of food for thought here. But if you just take a little bit of time to consider how it is that you might be received in response to the way in which you communicate with people, what do you think other people's response might be to you?